I'm talking to you. The button is magic, believe it or not. Bippity, boppity, boo. Hello friends, and welcome back to another tutorial. Now, I had previously made Cinderella, but I didn't film the process, so when planning this video I wasn't sure what version of Cindy I wanted. I really liked the idea of doing her dress in the movie accurate silver, but I tend to let the fabric dictate such decisions, so I headed down to the LA Fashion District. I started by looking for either blue or silver fabrics like jacquard, brocade, cotton sateen, taffeta, or dupioni. My one piece of advice for making gowns is to avoid satin as your main fabric unless it's a high quality bridal satin or you're layering things over it. Otherwise, it'll look pretty cheap. That being said, let's see what I found. So, a lot of people would not initially think to go for upholstery fabrics for gowns. However, a lot of upholstery fabrics, especially like curtain fabrics, have a really nice hand. Nice hand to them, and they have a lot of historically accurate prints. So this is always a good option if you're going for something more historically leaning. This place also has really nice like satins and taffetas, so let's take a look. So like for instance here, this brocade, this is really beautiful. This would be beautiful for Belle, but I don't see anything in like a light blue or silver that would work for Cinderella, so let's keep looking. You just feel a little thin. The heavier you go, the more weighty the dress is going to be, but you also don't want to go too thin and too light because then the dress will rip really easy. And since I'll be using this for princess parties, I want to make sure that it's going to stand up to a lot of kids, to playing and sitting on the dress, so let's keep looking. So laces like these are a really good way to add bling to your dress without having to spend a lot on full cuts of lace. So you can do something like this and just applique it over the bodice to add some decoration. You can also do it around the peplums, but at the same time you can also just buy a yard of lace and cut your own appliques from it, and that way you can kind of make it all cohesive. But yeah, these are very nice. Pale silvery blue. That's really pretty. That's really, really nice. So even though they're the same fabric, sometimes the dye lots are different, so you just want to make sure that it is in fact the same fabric if you're getting from multiple rolls. So that looks pretty close to me. Stays close enough. So let's go down. There's some great sequin shops down this way. Let's go. So I'm thinking this one because it's like, even though it's silver, it's got a white-ish base, and then I'll put a white satin under, and then a white organza over, and that'll dull it a little and also make it look very white while still capturing that shine that I really want. So I'm thinking this might be our winner. Alright, so I bought 3 yards. I'm figuring a yard each for each peplum, and then a half a yard for each shoulder piece. So let's go get some satin, some organza, 3 yards of this heavy pure white satin, and then 6 yards of this organza. I figure I'll probably do a couple layers, so that's why I got double this. But we're good to go. Let's start with the pattern, which will be available on my site next year, so be sure to sign up for notifications so you can be notified when it goes live. The details are in the description. I started by cutting out 1 layer of my bodice pattern out of my fashion fabric. My fabric was light, so I fused it to some muslin for strength, but I also forgot to film that. Then I made piping for the center 3 seams. To do this, I cut some wide strips of my 3 layers of fabric: white satin, silver sequin mesh, and white organza. They need to be a few inches longer than the seam you plan to place them in. After cutting and placing the layers, I folded them over some chunky white yarn and stitched right at the edge of the yarn. You can also use actual piping cord, but the yarn works just fine. Once I have it stitched, I trimmed down the excess fabric so it was as wide as my pattern seam allowance from the stitch line to the raw edge. Then I lined up the seam allowance of the piping with the seam allowance of the pattern, pinned them together, placing the other panel on top so it sandwiches the piping, and then stitched it as usual. I continued to assemble the bodice, sandwiching piping in the center front 3 seams, clipped the curves, being careful not to snip my stitching, and ironed it all. Then I cut and assembled, clipped the curves, and ironed a second layer of my pattern for the strength layer. Here I used twill, but you can use any fabric as outlined in my corset making series. Then I applied twill tape over the seams and seam allowance that is just slightly wider than my boning. You can learn how to do this in my single layer zipper corset video. I used 6mm wide synthetic whale boning from Burnley and Trowbridge for all the seams but the center. For the very center, I used a 1/2 inch wide, extra strong steel bone so that the front would lay straight and smooth, for which I used about a 3/4 inch twill tape to create the boning channel. Then I cut all of my boning to the length of the channels minus the seam allowance, sanded the tips, and inserted them. You want at least 1 bone in every seam, and if you're a fuller figure, you may want a bone in between each panel as well. From there, I stitched the channels closed along the top and bottom and clipped the curves, ironing the seam allowance down along the stitch line towards the twill tape side of the fabric, and top stitched it down, being careful to skip over the bones so that I did not break a needle. Then going back to the fashion layer, I measured up the seam allowance on the top and bottom edges and marked it. Alright, so the next part I did off camera because it's really fiddly and I wasn't really sure how to film it. Basically, you're going to lay your fashion layer on top of your strength layer with the boning channels facing the inside. Line up the backs so that the folded over edge of the inside strength layer meets up with the seam allowance line that we drew on the fashion layer, and then stitch it along the back so that those are secured. Then you're going to go along and smooth out and pin your fashion layer to your strength layer like so, top and bottom, making sure it's taut but not overly tight. Then you're going to fold your seam allowances over, whip stitch down your seam allowances to the strength layer, making sure not to catch any of the outside layer. That way it looks really smooth and invisible from the outside. I figured out the overlay, and to do this we do it just like we did with my bell bodice video. I simply cut another panel 6 and attached it to the edge here. Oh, pull that pin out. And ironed it over and stitched it down. I cut about a 2.5 inch panel and folded over about 1/2 inch and top stitched it down. Then I inserted a bone into the channel, and then I will sew it up here, just stitching down that casing as I sewed it down here too. Now it's time to go in and add the grommets, which I show you how to do in my corset making tutorial series, so I will link that up in the cards right wherever. I think it's there, yeah. So next we need to put some grommets in and assess the fit to figure out how tall our shoulder strap needs to be. So I'm going to finish up this other side and install some grommets. So to do that, I put this on the mannequin, or you can put it on yourself, and you want to find the distance from point front to point back on the shoulder and how tall you want your piece to be. And here I made a little mock-up to test the shape of our piece. And it's really simple, deceptively simple actually. It's just kind of a vague banana shape. And I made this piece wider because we want to gather it down at the points where it's going to get attached to the bodice. And then you want to make it curved so you can get that height on the top of the shoulder. But what's going to happen is we're going to sew it here, and it's going to crumple in and give it this really nice puffy shape, just like the park has. So we're going to cut this out of our 3 layers that we used for the piping. So we're going to cut one of the satin, one of the sequin mesh, and one of the organza. Sew it all together along this seam and then attach it to the bodice. So let's go do that. As I said, I cut 3 layers for the sleeves, but cut the organza wider as it's quite shifty and it can make it hard to sew it evenly, but we can trim this up after. Then I cut 2 rectangles for the shoulder strap that are the length from point to point over the shoulder, and really as wide as you like them. I sewed these along the sides to create a tube. From there, I pleated down the curved edge of the shoulder poof to the long, straight edge of the strap, right sides together, and then repeat on the opposite side, stitching it down. I took some crinoline or stiff tulle and gathered it on top of the strap and stitched along our previous stitch lines, tapering the tulle by cutting it shortest at the end of the sleeve and longest in the center. This will give us the poof that we want. Then I flipped the sleeve right side out and gathered the ends down, whip stitching them in place to be ready to attach to the bodice. Once again, I whip stitched the sleeves to only the strength layer so that the stitches don't show on the outside. Next we'll make our panniers. To do this, you'll need to measure the bottom edge of half of your bodice, as well as how long you want the pannier to sit. To make the pattern, I took the edge of the bodice measurement and doubled it. I treated this as a diameter and drew a half circle. Then, from the center point of the diameter, I squared up about 20 inches and marked that point. Then I drew a curve to make the shape into an arch instead of a circle. Don't forget to add seam allowance. You can then fold the paper in half and cut along your one line that you drew to get a symmetrical piece. Once again, I cut 2 panniers out of the 3 layers, plus an extra layer. I wanted to use white satin, but I ran out of it, so I used more of the silver base fabric. I layered the 3-layer piece and 1 layer of the silver fabric right sides together and stitched around them, leaving a few inches of a gap to pull it right side out. Then I clipped the corners, pulled it right side out, and ironed. From there, I pleated the curved edge to fit half of the edge of the bodice and whip stitched it to the inside of the bodice. I did it this way versus sewing the panniers to the skirt, so that if you raise your arms, you will never see the waistband of the skirt since the panniers will cover it. Lastly, I cut and assembled 1 more layer of the bodice out of a light satin. Then I folded the seam allowances down and whip stitched the lining to the bodice inside, making sure the stitches don't show outside at all. For the headband, I simply bought some white headbands from the local store and covered them with 3 layers of fabric using hot glue. And lastly, the skirt. This pattern is very simple. I started with the same pattern I used for Belle's underskirt. To do this, you're going to measure your waist circumference with your corset and your hoop skirt, plus any petticoats you plan to wear. You must have a corset to support the weight of the gown and not have it dig into your skin. Then I divided that circumferential measurement by 4. Then measure how long your skirt needs to be, plus a few inches for the hem. And lastly, find the circumference of the bottommost hoop and divide by 4. Now, fold a piece of paper in half. It should be slightly wider than the bottom quarter hoop circumference measurement and slightly longer than your desired length. Divide the quarter hoop measurement by 2 and square over the bottom. Then mark up the folded edge your desired length. Then square over half of your quarter waist measurement. Connect the 2 lines, add seam allowance to all but the folded edge, and cut through both layers. This we shall call our trapezoid pattern. Then you'll need to draft a quarter circle skirt pattern. To do so, you can follow the link in my cards to my circle skirt video. But make sure the length is the same length as the trapezoid pattern we just drafted. Don't forget the seam allowance. Now, cut 4 of your trapezoid pattern and 4 of your skirt pattern. Sew them together, alternating trapezoid, circle, till all 8 panels are sewn together. But leave an 8-inch gap at the top in one seam. This will be our opening for the skirt. Hem the opening with a small rolled hem. From there, I pleated the circle skirt panels into a double box pleat to get Cindy's iconic skirt lines, making sure the 2 seams at the top touch and ironing them down. Then, stitch the skirts onto a piece of twill tape that's long enough to tie into a small bow around your waist, and then cover the waistband with some bias tape made from your fabric. Hem your raw edges and your skirt is ready. Lastly, I added some lovely handmade earrings from the Quirky Creation, gloves from eBay, and shoes from Depop. Stay tuned the week after next for how I cut and styled the wig, and 2 weeks thereafter for how I did the makeup. All fabric amounts and pattern options will be on my website linked down below. Thank you so much for watching. If you're not already, consider subscribing and hitting that share button. It really helps out the channel. And remember, cosplay is all about having fun. Bye!